give us, that I will let you be done. We are spent actually quite a bit of time in the Jeremiah readings today. Um, the it's interesting. Chronicles and Kings really don't say a lot about either Jehoahaz or Jehoiakim. They kind of, or really the rest of these kings. You really kind of, it seems like in both of them, and particularly in the Kings, we get to this point. We're finished with Josiah, and at that point, it's just done. And so the spiral is completed. And it's almost like, okay, then we had Jehoahaz and we got rid of him, and we bring Jehoiakim and he lasted this long and he wasn't any good. And then we bring in Zedekiah and he's done. And finally, God says enough, and then it's all taken care of. So they don't give really a lot of details, and that's why I wanted to do some cross reading in Jeremiah, because Jeremiah gives a lot of some specific stories that happen that can help fill in some of the gaps. Because when we read, for example, when it describes Jehoiakim, and I don't think I'm spoiling the plot to say, Jehoiakim is a bad king. He just says he was evil. We don't really know what that entailed, what that meant, what he did. But when we read Jeremiah, we start to get a sense of who exactly he was. And we'll really see that when we get to Zedekiah, who to me is, we'll talk about him in a few weeks, one of the most interesting characters in the Bible, and really one of the most tragic, because Zedekiah, maybe more than any of these kings, had his chance and he knew what he needed to do. He knew what was right, and you can tell that he knew what was right, and he just didn't do it. That you could probably argue that a lot of these guys were going to be in that vein as well. Let's go and have a word of prayer first, and then we will start. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for our day, for the brethren here, for this church, and for our chance to come together tonight and study your will and study your word and understand your people more and the history of the faith, and take learning lessons from their failures, applying them to our lives. Helps to be more faithful in this life. Helps to glorify you in all that we do here. We pray in your son's name. Amen. All right. So I did want to put up half of a timeline. Well, there's a lot of little things in our reading that I wanted to put in here, and I'll leave this up. This is the only slide I've really got, but just to give you a little bit of a context of what's going on during all of this. 609, if you remember from last week, was the year that Josiah died. He killed. Remember, how did Josiah die? Yep, shot in the chest with an arrow, or shot under the arm with an arrow. By who? I'm not looking for a specific person here, but what group of people was he fighting? The Egyptians, right? And that's kind of important, because what's going to happen, and we've kind of alluded to this already, that Jehoahaz then is made king, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Uh, Eventually, we're not told exactly how long it takes. Well, we are, because he lasts about 3 months. After that, Pharaoh Necho comes back down through Jerusalem or through Judea, and he deposes Jehoahaz, and he puts Jehoiakim on the throne. And so he's going to last from 609 to 597. And the reason that's useful to know in this background is because when you're going to read, if you go back and read Jeremiah, and some of the other prophecies, Ezekiel and some of the other people of that day, you're going to read some things about Egypt, and you're thinking, why are we talking about Egypt? Egypt is not involved in this. This is about the Babylonians. Well, the reason for that is that there's going to be a pretty good amount of time in here which Egypt is kind of fading as a power, but they're trying to reassert themselves, and so they come up and they try to form alliances and they try to fight back. And Israel, for whatever reason, is absolutely convinced that if Egypt is our security, Egypt is our help. If we can just get Egypt to be on, if we can just be on their side, Egypt will protect us. Now, if you're an Israelite and you're reading that, and you're thinking about, why in the world would Israel want to have protection from Egypt of all places? What does that what does that make you think? What thought process come into your mind when you start thinking about that relationship? They were slaves to Egypt. Yeah. That was the whole point, right? The whole point of you being here was to get away from Egypt. And what's interesting is that whenever you see the language of Egypt used in the Old Testament, sometimes Egypt a lot of times is symbolizes things, even though it's a real nation and they're really there, they really have armies, but there's more going on than just Israel wanting to go back to Egypt. Because when they were in Egypt, what were they doing? Were they being faithful to God when they were enslaved to Egypt? Not really. They were worshiping other gods. They were worshiping the Egyptian gods so much so that when they came out of the into the wilderness, their first impulse when they didn't know what to do when Moses was gone was to do what? Make a golden calf, because that's what we know. That's what we've been doing. And so there's this constant struggle of Israel wanting to go back where they came from. They regret it when they're in the wilderness. They come back and they're constantly trying to be more like the nations around about them. They're wanting to go back to Egypt. They're wanting an alliance with Egypt. And even at the very end of Jeremiah, guess where when Jerusalem is destroyed, and we've got a number of people who are basically homeless and outcasts at this point. The Babylonians left them there to fend for themselves. Where do they go? They go back to Egypt. They decide we're all just going to go back to Egypt because that seems like our best option. And so you're going to see that language, and Jehoiakim gets really caught up in that. And we're going to read, particularly in Jeremiah and some of the prophecies about him, that he keeps seeming to lean on Egypt and wanting to be involved with Egypt. And the prophets keep saying, no, no, no. Your key to safety and how you're going to survive all this, and this is where it gets kind of surprising a little bit, is to do what? What nation should you align yourself with if you want to survive and you're Israel? This is a tricky question, I guess, and maybe I should just say it. Because jo- jo- Jeremiah is going to have one consistent message throughout the book. That is, the Babylonians are coming. And when they get here, the way that you're going to survive is you put down your arms and you come out of the city and you go where they tell you to go. And if you'll do that, what will God do? What does God promise that He will do? He's going to bring you back. He's going to take care of you. This is very, very different. If you remember, when the Assyrians came and surrounded Jerusalem, remember this a few weeks ago? The Rabshakeh comes and the army surround the city of Jerusalem. And remember his offer? He comes in, he comes up and speaks Hebrew to the people on the wall and said, look, come on out. I will take you away to a land and it's got all these wonderful things. It's beautiful. It's got food. It's got water, everything you ever want. Just come and you'll be happy. What was the answer to that? Did God want them to go with the Assyrians? No, there was never any question of going out. These people were blaspheming the name of God. They were destroying everything around them. Who knows if they were really they were going to disperse them just like they did with Israel. That's what God had them do. But now they're being told to go ahead and go along with these. In fact, I think it's in our reading this week, one of our passages of Jeremiah, where God through Jeremiah calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. That just doesn't sound right, right? This is a horrible nation and a horrible person. And in fact, if you remember, I wanted to start out a little bit in Habakkuk because I think it sets the tone pretty well. Did y'all have a chance to read Habakkuk? I had it listed. I don't know. I know sometimes we don't get to the auxiliary reading, um, but I wanted to look at it, and I think I had a question on it because I think it sums pretty well what's going on during this time. Because if you remember, I think the question I asked about Habakkuk was, what is Habakkuk's initial complaint? What when he goes to God in chapter 1 and cries out to God, what is he upset about? What does he want God to do? Okay, whose violence and iniquity? It doesn't actually say, but if you read it, do you get a sense of who he's talking about there? Look at what he says in verse 3. So why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. What does that sound like he's talking about there? Where is he seeing injustice, you think? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right, and that these are the same things. If you remember, if you've read Amos and some of the other prophets that were during this time before that and leading up to Habakkuk, that's what they've been saying. You know, God's people you're abusing the poor, you're perverting justice, you're making yourself rich at the expense of others, you're not worshiping God properly, you're doing everything that God has told you not to do in the law. And Habakkuk is sitting here going, God, do you not see this? How long are you going to allow this to keep going? Because the prophets have been coming to Israel and to Judah for hundreds of years, trying to get them to change. And Habakkuk says, why are you letting this go? Now, what's God's answer? What does God say he's going to do? Yeah. So I have an answer. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans. I'm going to bring the Babylonians. He calls them the bitter and hasty nation. They're dreaded, verse 7, and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. He goes on, describes just who these people are. He says in verse 10, at kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep up like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Does that sound like a particularly noble group of people coming in? These are people that they're basically these guys are worse than the Assyrians. They just take whatever they want. They destroy cities and they just go on about their way. They have no regard for anything other than, as he says, their own might is their God. Whatever I can conquer, that's what I'm going to go do. And of course, Habakkuk's response to that is, what? He said, that's not really what I had in mind. Wait a second. I wanted you to judge the nation, but I didn't. Why are you bringing these people? He says in verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? We may be bad, but we're not them. We're not as bad as the Babylonians are. Why are you bringing them? Um, he says he brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, and he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offering to his dragnet. You know what he's talking about there? In other words, basically, his God is the loot and the pillage that he can get out of whatever cities he goes and destroys. And he says, there, for by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? So now first of all, it was God. Are you just going to let Israel continue to rot and contaminate into sin and ungodliness? No, I'm going to fix it. I'm bringing the Babylonians. Well, wait a second. Are you just going to let them continue to pillage and rape throughout the land forever and do what they're doing? And Habakkuk's answer in verse 1 of chapter 2, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And God answers. And he goes through and talks about the fact that, look, and just to sum up, he's saying, I understand who they are. I know what they're doing. And they're not going to be excused from that. And he says, I'm going to bring judgment on them just as I'm bringing judgment on you. And he makes the point that God's people have not been forgotten, that he's going to use them as a means of punishment, but he's also going to pronounce woes on them and bringing them to justice as well for their idolatry and for their ungodliness. And Habakkuk 3, which is one of the great prayers in all of the Bible. I think I quoted this. I didn't put it on Facebook. I quoted it on Twitter the other day. But, Habakkuk's response in hearing this and what's going to happen uh, and the horrors that he is about to see is in verse 17. Well, in verse 16, he says, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. In others, I'm not happy about this. I fear for what's about to happen to our country. But he says, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, the flocks be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like deer. He keeps me treading on the high places. You know, this idea that, okay, I accept God's judgment. And I'm going to rejoice in God because God is righteous and God has promised that He will he will do right and he will do just. It's one of the great professions of faith in all the Old Testament. And when you think about what's about to happen in Judah and what's about to happen to Jerusalem, and the fact that there are still righteous people in this kingdom and still righteous people in this city, they're going to have to see all of this. That's the kind of faith that they had to have. When we talk about men like Daniel, I put Daniel chapter 1 on the reading list largely because I wanted you to see kind of the context of where it fits in all of this. Daniel is probably going to be in this first group in about 605. This is when Nebuchadnezzar is going to come to after he hears that Egypt has got the king Jehoiakim on their side and Jehoiakim is rebelling. So now he's going to come back with his armies in 605 and take the city again. And he's going to take the first round of captives, which would have included Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and those people. He's going to take three different waves of captivity. The second one is going to be in 597 when Jehoiakim, who is Jehoiakim's son, takes the throne for about 3 months. Uh, he takes the throne. There's rebellion once again. He is he's taken off into captivity, and Zedekiah, who is Jehoahaz's brother, is put on the throne, and Jehoiakim is taken into Babylonian captivity. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So it gets a little confusing because when you look at the kings that we had, the first one we talked about is Jehoahaz, who is the one who he's going to reign about 3 months. He is one of the sons of Josiah. But what's interesting about this and what's difficult about it or tricky, if you go over to look at First Chronicles 3 verse 15, there's this is the part of Chronicles where he goes through the uh, the genealogy of the exiles who are coming back, and he's listing the sons of the kings here. And in verse 15, he says, "The sons of Josiah: Johanan, the firstborn; second, Jehoiakim; third, Zedekiah; and the fourth, Shallum." Now, Shallum, from most people believe that that is most likely talking about Jehoahaz. He is referred to as Shallum in one of the writings in Josiah. That's the name that appears to be given to him. Maybe his personal name as opposed to his kingly name. That's typically when you became king, they gave you a new name, which is why we sometimes see people called different things during that time. In fact, for example, anybody remember what Jehoiakim's name was before he was put on the throne by Pharaoh Necho? If you know any of the Hebrew prefixes, they're very similar because whenever you see Jah, what does that typically refer to? When you see somebody whose name starts with a J E or Jeho, what does that sound? What name does that sound like? Jehovah. It's typically a reference to God. In fact, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember what Jehoiakim means. It might be God is faithful, or I can't remember what exactly it is. His given name was Eliakim, which is a pretty similar. In fact, it's another way of saying God. It's not the name Yahweh, but it's still a reference to God. So his name was Eliakim. It was changed by Necho to Jehoiakim, and he was put on the throne. Um, he is actually the older of the two. Nobody's really sure who Johanan is. Most people think that he probably was the firstborn that died early on as a child or something like that. But when it came time to go on the throne, if you remember the reading, this may just kind of slip by you. It's kind of it almost feels like an incidental thing. But back in 2 Kings chapter 23, when it tells us how Josiah died, it says in verse 30, um, that the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's place. Now, what's unusual about that is that they used the word anointed, which that doesn't seem like it would be very unusual because what do you do with a king? You anoint him king. But the king's account only uses that in two other examples. It only talks about anointing king twice. One of them was Solomon. Now, what was going on? Do you remember the story of Solomon? What was going on when Solomon was made king? What was the obstacle that was going on at the time? Do you remember? Yeah, yeah. His older brother, who theoretically, as the oldest, had a claim to the throne, was going around trying to claim to be king. So David takes him, the high priest anoints him and makes him king. So there's no dispute. He is anointed king. He has to be king, even though he's not the oldest. The second person that we'll read about is in the case of Jehoash or Joash. Of course, you remember his story, right? Who was king when Jehoash was born? Maybe I shouldn't say king. Who was ruling? Yeah, Athaliah was reigning, and she was firmly in charge. And they basically were essentially to get Joash on the throne. They were kind of having to institute a coup, weren't they? They were basically having to restore the king line back to the line of David. And so the king writer again points out that they anointed Joash. They made sure there's no dispute. He is the king. So it's interesting that here, the third time and the only other time that it's referred to, it's in reference to Jehoahaz, who is the younger brother of Jehoiakim, which leads you to believe that there's no way to know this because we're not told, but it kind of sounds like, if you remember what we read, who made Jehoahaz king? Who named him king? Who does it say in verse back in 2 Kings? The people. Yeah, the people did. Now, who is in charge of Judah at this point? You know, Necho just beat Jerusalem. Necho just took over. He is now in charge. So when he comes back in 3 months, what's he going to do? Who's he going to put on the throne? His brother, Jehoiakim. It kind of makes it seem as if I almost wonder whether Pharaoh Necho had said, "All right, I'm taking over. Jehoiakim, you're the oldest. You're king. I'll be back. I've got to," because he's on his way back up to fight with the Babylonians. So he doesn't have time to deal with this. So he's going to leave. And the people, I wouldn't be surprised at all. They say, you know what? If he wants him, no, we're taking his younger brother. We're going to make him king. So Necho comes back and says, no, this is the one I wanted. And so he installs Jehoiakim on the older onto the throne. And what you're going to see later on is Jehoiakim tends to be very loyal to Egypt uh, until right around 606, I think it is 605, when when the first round of captives come because Nebuchadnezzar hears that he's allied himself with Egypt. He comes in, brings in his forces. All of a sudden, Jehoiakim is friendly with Babylon again for 3 years, and then he revolts again, which is why in 597 Babylon has to come back, and they again put Israel under siege. During that siege, Jehoiakim is going to die, and Jehoiachin, his son, takes the throne. Again, we'll talk about him a little bit more in his situation uh, in the next weeks. But once Babylon comes back, Jehoiakim is taken away. He's removed. He's taken to Babylon, and Zedekiah, who is also Jehoiakim's brother, is put on the throne. So basically, three brothers, three sons of Josiah get to rule, and you could probably make an argument that one is worse than the next the longer they go. So Josiah's sons have three chances to right the ship, and each one of them first fails. So if you ever come across some of the different names that are used there as you read, that's one of the things that's kind of going on during this time. So with that, there's not really a lot specifically I wanted to talk about the kings themselves, but I do want to go and look at some things that we see in Jeremiah because I think, like I said, Jeremiah kind of gives us some insight into what's going on during this. Does anybody remember if you had a chance to do the reading, did you find a clue in Jeremiah 25 that indicates when Jeremiah was prophesying during all this time? Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, he says in verse 3, for 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, which would have been about 627-ish, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, to this day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I have spoken persistently to you, but you have not listened. So he's been preaching for 23 years during the times, when Josiah has been in king, and Josiah has been listening and doing things. In fact, the 13th year of Josiah would have been right after the time when Josiah started to seek the Lord. We read in his 12th year, he started to seek the Lord. In the 16th year, he started to go out and actively purge idolatry. So it would seem that Josiah had a lot of impact on him and all the things that he did. But after Josiah's gone, things start to fall apart again. And Josiah's continuing to, Jeremiah's continuing to preach, continuing to try to teach the word to them, but he's getting more and more resistance. And it's kind of interesting that you start to see, if you really start tracking some names, you start to see some people that are going to be involved in Jehoiakim's rule that were also involved in Josiah's rule. They're still trying to hold things together. But Jehoiakim seems to be actively trying to pull Israel away from God. Uh, and in fact, if you look at the timeline here, from 609, 586 is when the temple is destroyed. So we're really just about done in terms of time. There's just not a lot of time left for Israel. But during that short amount of time when Jehoiakim takes the reins, he begins to pull Israel back away from God. In fact, he starts to actively interfere. Because if you look at let's look at some passages in Jeremiah. Look over at Jeremiah 26. And I have to, it's a little tricky because it jumps around. Jeremiah is not a very structured book. It jumps from, it's not written in sequence. So you kind of have to jump around a little bit and you have to search and find what's written when. And sometimes we don't really know. But there are some ones that give us some ideas of when he's writing. In chapter 26, it tells us that in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, the word came from the Lord. And this is where um, he basically tells him, this is what I've been doing. It's interesting that God tells Jeremiah to go and stand in the court of the Lord's house and speak to all the cities. And he says in verse 3, oh, he says, do not hold back a word. It may be that they will listen, and everyone turn from his evil ways, that I may relent of the disaster that I intend to do to them because of their evil deeds. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago that when the prophets come in the days of Josiah, and the tone seems to change. It's no longer about maybe the city won't be destroyed. It's going to happen. It's going to be destroyed, but maybe you can be saved from the worst of it. So it's interesting to me that as Jeremiah goes out and as we get closer, the message of the Lord goes back to, again, look, maybe we can. Maybe there's a way that we don't have to do this. God continually comes back to that idea that this is not what I want to do to my people. I don't want to destroy them, but maybe they'll listen this time. So God continues to show his mercy and his patience, and he sends the messenger once again. And so it's interesting what happens that Jeremiah in chapter 26 goes, he speaks in the court of the temple, and he makes this appeal. And notice down in verse 7, it says that the priests and the prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house. And when Jeremiah had finished all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to all the people, then the priests and the prophets and all the people laid hold of him, saying, you shall die. Why have you prophesied in the name of the Lord, saying, this house shall be like Shiloh, this city shall be desolate without inhabitants? Why were they mad? Why were they mad at Jeremiah? What was really bothering them? Did it bother them that he was saying you need to follow the Lord? It doesn't seem like it did. In fact, we're going to look at some things early on that indicate that the people were at least superficially serving God. What bothered them was that, how dare you tell us that we're wrong? How dare you tell us that God is going to punish us? Does that sound, by the way, does that sound like kind of how people react when we talk about the fact that, by the way, there's a judgment coming and we need to make our lives right with God? Who do you think you are? Telling us that we're going to be destroyed, telling us that we're condemned. What right have you? It's the prophets and the priests, the people that ought to be leading this, ought to be on his side, trying to bring the people back. The people that, if you remember, during Josiah's time, they were lined up with Josiah, helping with these reforms, trying to bring people back. But here, they're saying, no, this man, we need to put this man to death. But what's interesting is in verse 10, it says, when the officials of Judah heard these things, they came up from the king's house to the house of the Lord, took their seats in the entry of the new gate. And then the priests and the prophets said to the officials and to all the people, this man deserves the sentence of death because he has prophesied against the city as you have heard with your own ears. Now, as Jeremiah makes his case, it's interesting to me that the response of the officials and the people having heard him in verse 16, what is their response? Yeah, we can't put this man to death. The officials, and remember, a lot of the officials, and we'll see this in a little bit in a minute, are the people that were under Josiah, and they're the ones saying, "Look, we can't we can't do that to a prophet." Jehoiakim is going to be another matter, as we're going to see. But the priests and the prophets who see their word being disputed. If you remember, we talked about this a little bit last week, and we talked about it in the Ezekiel class, in the Ezekiel reading, I should say, that the prophets are telling the people, look, everything's going to be fine. God is okay with us. The Babylonians, you're hearing all these rumors about the Babylonians. It's going to be fine. They'll never touch us. We're secure. And now Jeremiah is coming and contradicting everything that they're saying. He's threatening their power. Go ahead. It's probably a little bit before, but it's the same kind of thing. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's going to happen. The temple's destroyed 586. I haven't put this up yet because we haven't got to it yet, but around, oh, I can't remember. It's around here on the timeline is when that's going to happen, because that's when Zedekiah is on the throne. It's the final years. You've got the second wave of exiles, including Ezekiel, who's going to be taken away. They're going to be over in over in Babylon. And yeah, the priests and the prophets in Jerusalem are sending a message saying, "Look, everything's gonna be fine. Just hold tight. God's gonna bring us right back." And as you said, Jeremiah is saying, "No, that's not right. You need to stay there. You're gonna be there for a while." And in fact, uh, in it's in chapter 25, and we'll flip that. Well, we don't necessarily have to flip back there because I know we've got a limited amount of time. But in Jeremiah chapter 25, Jeremiah lines out exactly what's going to happen. He gives them the full picture. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans. They're going to besiege the city and they're going to take you into captivity. But he's very specific. After 70 years, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to restore your lands. And so there's that idea again of I'm going to punish you, but even in punishing you, I'm not fully casting you out. I'm not fully forgetting who you are. So in fact, he's going to also punish the nations that are going to take them into captivity. Um, excuse me. And I think it's interesting, by the way. I kind of glazed over this, but when you have this first round of exiles, the first punishment as a result of this first round of exile, what happens in the Babylonian government? Who gets installed in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar? Hmm? No, not him. Um, who's that first round? Daniel. What happens with Daniel? He's going to become one of the chief magicians. He's put over basically the entire land. By the time that the exiles are down here, Daniel is pretty well established. In fact, if you remember, I think we read this in our readings last Thursday, that when God tells Ezekiel, go and tell the people that if these three men were alive and in Jerusalem today, and you remember who he mentioned? He mentioned Job, Daniel, and okay, what was the other? Who was the other one? Uh, was it Noah? It was Noah, I think. It was Noah, Daniel, and Job. If these three people were alive today in Jerusalem, they would only deliver themselves. It wouldn't matter. Which tells you that by this time, everybody knew who Daniel was, and they understood his reputation and the things that he had done, and the righteousness that he had shown. And so, when you think about what's going on, remember when the last time Israel went as a nation went into captivity, which, as we said, was in Egypt. How did God prepare for that? What happened before Israel ever went into captivity? Who set the stage for all of that? Who was the first one to go down to Egypt? Joseph was. So God sends Joseph to become the most powerful man next to Pharaoh to make sure that when it was time for Israel to come down there, what would happen? They would be blessed. They would get the best of the land. They would be taken care of. Oh, what happens here? Before the people are even brought out, before Jerusalem is destroyed, he already has someone in place that is in a good position to make sure that these people are going to be taken care of. They're going to be in exile, but they're not going to be destroyed. In fact, by the time we get through the course of all this time, there's a number of Jews that become very prominent in government to the point that we get to the story of Esther. Are the Jews left without left without hope when one of the men decides, I want to kill all the Jews? Well, guess what? Esther is a queen, and Mordecai is at the king is someone with the king's favor, and all of a sudden you've got Jewish influence that is again right there to help them when they need it. So God, even from the very beginning, even while He's punishing His people, is laying the foundation so that He can protect them at the same time, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And it shows again that the grace and the planning of God through all of this. That we talk about God pouring out His wrath, and we think about the wrath of God. People a lot of times picture that as God throwing a temper tantrum. He just loses control, just gets angry, and just starts wrecking things. But that's not the picture that we see in the Bible. The wrath of God is something that is poured out because it has to be, justice has to be served. But it is not uncontrolled, and it is not without thought, and it is not separated from love and care and providence. And I think that's exactly what we see. Even at the very beginning, we start to see those things being put into place. So we only got a few more minutes, but let's see what I wanted to. I may pick up a little bit on this next week too, because there's a few things I wanted to talk about. If you'll notice in 26, I think it's 26 that I wanted to show. I mentioned some of the some of the pictures that we get of Jehoiakim and why he is called an evil king. If you notice, the elders have stood up and stood and defended Jeremiah and said, he's going to be we can't allow this to happen. There's another prophet that was not so fortunate in verse 20. A man named Uriah, the son of Shemaiah. He prophesied against the city and against the land in the words like those of Jeremiah. And look what Jehoiakim does. Jehoiakim sends people out to put him to death. This man flees to Egypt, and Jehoiakim has them go all the way down to Egypt, go get him and bring him back so that he can kill him. So that's the kind of king that Jehoiakim was. And we'll see real quickly here in a few minutes. We'll see a little bit more about his attitude. How even worse than anybody else around him, he seems absolutely dead set on turning his back on God. But notice something here down verse 24. But the hand of uh, Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, was with Jeremiah so that he was not given over to the people to be put to death. Now, there's a very good chance that you probably are not going to remember that name because it's one of a number of different names. But again, this is another example of there are people that are in this administration that were also back with Josiah, and one of them is this man named Ahikam. Because all the way back in 2 Kings 22, when when Josiah is on the throne, and they bring in the book of the law, and they said, "This is what God wants us to do," and Josiah tears his clothes. Down in verse 12, after hearing the law, he says, "The king commanded Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam the son of Shaphan, same guy, and Achbor the son of Micaiah and Shaphan the secretary." Shaphan is also mentioned here, and tells them to go find out what the word of the Lord is about this. So here's a man who has seen all of this. He's seen the 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 the, the threats of death that were given to God, and he's seen how God has delivered them, and seen what they did under Josiah, and now he's seeing Jehoiakim tear all of that apart. And to his credit, he's somebody that on more than one occasion is going to step in and help Jeremiah. In fact, his son later on is going to be the one that helps to keep Jeremiah from being put to death. And so it's encouraging to see that as bad as things were in Jerusalem, there were still godly men. There were still men who were concerned about the word of God that still wanted to make sure that Jehoiakim doesn't go just so far as he's trying to go, because he is completely determined not to listen to God. So much so that if you remember, when you go over to chapter 36 hmm, of still in Jeremiah, this is a story that I think maybe you've heard as well. Actually, I want to go back. Let's see. I think it's. I might want to say it in 35. Go ahead and go there. I want to check back to one other thing because I wanted to point one other thing out. Uh, go to 36. Now, it's 25. Let's see, 26. I think it was 25 then. Well, maybe it's in 30. There's a passage in here that says that by this time, by the time that this comes around, Josiah is going to send, oh, I think it is in 36. Josiah is going to send Baruch, his helper. He's going to tell him to read to the people because, oh yeah, it's in chapter 36, because he's banned from the court. It's like by this time they don't even allow me into the temple anymore. So he sends his assistant with this scroll of prophecy and says, I want you to go and take this and read it in the presence of the people. And again, the same thing it says in verse 3, it may be that the house of Judah will hear all the disasters that God intends. Let's try this one more time. And so they send him to read. And this time, as he goes and reads, in fact, it's in the fifth year of Jehoiakim in verse 9, that there's a day of fasting that's going to be called. In fact, it says that all the people of Jerusalem called a day of fasting. This is when this probably happened. It's what happened is in chapter 36, the first time that Jeremiah sends him to the temple to read, it's before the siege. Everything is still fine. Nobody's listening. Well, then we have the first siege and we have exiles taken away, and now all of a sudden Babylon is in charge and things are really not looking good. And it's at this time that we read that the people, apparently not Jehoiakim, but the people have called for a day of fasting. In other words, they're worried about what's going on. They're seeking God to help them. And it's at this point that Jeremiah sends him back. Okay, let's read the scroll one more time. And so they read it, the elders hear it, the people hear it, and they say, this is concerning. And so they take it to the counselors. He takes it to the king. They read it before the king. And what is Jehoiakim's response to the scroll? Do you remember? Yeah. Yeah. He just every time, okay, a few times I just cut it, throw it in the fire. Right. Yeah. And he just burns it up. So even the people at this point are saying, maybe we should be listening to what God has to say. And Jehoiakim says, no, we're not going to listen to it. We are not going to do this. Even after this, he continues to rebel. So that's when we talk about Jehoiakim being evil. Yeah, it is. In fact, he needed help, and in fact, it says that both he and Jeremiah, because the Lord hid them, because he was ready to put them to death too. So that's the state of the throne as it has kind of gone downhill as Jehoiakim has been there. At least there's some support, but as you're going to get into Zedekiah, that support's going to start to dwindle even more and more and more and more. Nobody's going to want to listen to what Jeremiah has to say about anything. So just that's some background for us. We're going to start talking a little bit more about the time of Zedekiah next time, Lord willing. So with that, Mark, I guess it's you.